Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Tumblin. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Santara Gonzales. Santara is the executive director and co-founder of Wisdom Unlocked, which has programs designed to introduce Stoic principles to those facing difficult circumstances in life. A huge part of this is aimed at incarcerated individuals who have found their way into the prison systems. Santara's work is tremendously valuable and important in the world, and I was very happy to get to discuss these topics with her in depth. In this episode, we talk about moral judgment, why we should have compassion for everyone and be mindful of our judgment towards them, the difficulties people have when finally attaining freedom from prison, and much, much more. This is quite a heavy episode, so brace thyself. But without further ado, please welcome Santara Gonzales. But yeah, I was bumping around on the website. It's made a lot of progress since the last time I looked at it. So yeah, you guys have really been busy. You and Kai, I guess.
Yeah, and we've added, a lot of content, and I'm loving the website. I think it's beautiful and it's clear, and it really portrays what we're about and the work that we are doing and will hopefully be doing for the next decades. So I'm really really proud of it.
Yeah, well, and I'm happy to hear that it's a long-term venture for you. You're mentioning 10 years. A lot of times these stuff gets started and we have such a short range, I suppose, into the future and what we want to accomplish. But yeah, I mean, I think we tend to we tend to think that we can't accomplish much, or we can accomplish so much in a short period. But man, 10 years. If you commit yourself to 10 years to anything, you're going to be really good at it, or at least significantly better than you are when you started. So I'm happy to hear it's a long term venture for you. Just so I guess would be a great place to start. And I love the name, by the way, Wisdom Unlocked. Understanding what the website's about. But what are you trying to achieve there, you and Kai, on Wisdom Unlocked?
So what we're trying to do is to take stoicism in places where you won't find it, right? So we traditionally find it in classrooms, we find it in groups online, in meetup groups, but we don't find it in prisons. And when you look at the situations in prisons, when you look at why men and women, even juveniles, end up in prison, there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of unresolved conflict, whether it's with themselves, with their families, with their communities, and to be able to give them the tools that they need to really turn your challenges into opportunities and your pain into growth, and to have that loss into a sense of purpose. That's huge for us to be able to provide those tools that can really change the outlook of the men and women that are incarcerated despite their incarceration, because it's not about
Mhm.
where you are, but it's about the work that you're doing despite of where you are. And it's really interesting. We just last week we met a correctional officer who is a practicing stoic, and that's something that I never would have thought about. I never would have put those two together, and that's what we're really trying to do. We're trying to put incarceration and prison system, match that up with stoicism, and provide men and women the tools to grow and to have a chance to live a flourishing life. Why shouldn't they have that, right? So that's what we're trying to do. So we have in prison
For sure.
programs, and then we're also going to be taking this program into the communities. And then we also have a program where we pick up incarcerated men and women from the prisons or from the jails, and we drive them to their final destination, whether that's going to be with their families or with the transitional housing. We take them for a warm meal and have conversations and introduce them to basic Stoic principles, just through conversation, right? We take them shopping for that first new outfit, which is important because we are wanting to restore the sense of humanity that gets stripped from you, right? When you enter a setting like that. And then we accompany them on their journey as far as they want us or need us to accompany them. So it's also trying to provide that holistic approach. It's definitely not a one-off, you
Hmm.
know.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. I There's a lot of back work that has to lead up to what you're doing. And I don't even mean organizationally, but I mean for you as a person to have that perspective, because we tend to be very judgmental, I think, naturally. I know when I was younger I was very judgmental towards people. Not even uh inmates or criminals, but like everyone in general. I was so
Mm.
judgmental. So like, what do you think feeds into that? Like, how did you get to the point where, because obviously, you have a website and your work, and you plan on dedicating a significant portion of your life to this particular thing. How do you come to be less judgmental and see these people as even worthy of I suppose a flourishing life, which I think, shockingly enough, I think a lot of people struggle with that judgment aspect.
Well, for me, it was growth, and that's putting it mildly. When I came to Stoicism, I had a very challenging 2019. It was extremely challenging, and everything I was trying to do to change my narrative and to change my perspective just wasn't working. And then I was introduced to Stoicism, and the first thing I learned is that we shouldn't be judging others, right? That was really really impactful to me. And also, I want to backtrack a little bit. I also started working in prisons in 2017. I was working with a different nonprofit, and I ran programs in 10 adult prisons in California, starting in 2017. And when you enter those gates, you really realize that we are all 5 minutes away from a wrong decision. We are all 5 minutes away from that mistake, and that we could end up behind those walls. And the reason some of us aren't behind those walls is because we stopped, tested our impressions, and checked ourselves, and did made it had a different response to a certain situations, where someone reacted to a certain situation and acted on whatever triggered them. And there's a lot of trauma in prisons. There's a lot of pain, and we are not the sum of all of our mistakes. We really aren't. We're all fallible. We've all made mistakes, and I don't want to be judged on every mistake I've made. So why should we be judging others for the mistakes they made, even though their mistakes may have been more grave and bigger, and the justice system penalized them by putting them in an incarcerated setting, by putting them in prison. That still doesn't mean that they're not worthy of living a flourishing life. At the end of the day, when we look at our circles of concern, I believe for myself, it is our duty, if we do Stoic work, to pull these men and women into our circle of concern. We want to pull people towards us and not push them away. And that's something that we really practice. And when you step onto those yards, those prison yards, that's what you're doing. You're pulling people inwards towards your circle of concern, because I'm there to serve and not to judge. So for me, I take this work very seriously.
Yeah, for sure, and I can definitely hear your passion for it. I think I mean, I can tell you personally, I had an experience when I was 15. I had my driver's license for like a month, like an embarrassingly short period of time, and got into a car accident, and just being dumb and overcorrected, lack of skill, distracted slightly. Didn't It wasn't a cell phone for those probably wondering. It was actually bonfire night, where we have this event in up. I don't know if you have that in the U.S., but in Canada we have a bonfire night where you basically go out on the beach with a bunch of people in small town Newfoundland, and you light up a big bonfire. And I was just distracted by that, and ended up hitting a parked car, nobody in it. It was just me, and kind of wrecked the whole thing. And obviously I was shook up by that, but what struck me more wasn't what happened. It was what could have happened with that was completely it could have been completely out of my control. So, and the reason that comes to mind is because this is when I sort of realized that a lot of times people that end up in these in prison, a lot of times it's things that are really just not up to them. Something happened. Now, obviously, I should have been a better driver, but if you look about how that, what the result was I damaged a vehicle.
Mm.
The result could have been a, a child was walking up that road at the same time that I was driving up there, which wasn't even statistically low. Like that was probably statistically pretty high because again, it was bonfire night. Everyone was out. There was lots of kids around. I could have struck a kid. I could have killed a person, would have been in prison for manslaughter. And that's what scared me the most. But it gave me this, I guess, this compassion and empathy for people who end up in these situations. So, because you brought up, yeah, sometimes we make impulsive decisions and choices that end up putting us into a bad place. Sometimes it's not even up to us. Sometimes
Mm.
the result ultimately has factors that we have no control over. I could still be in prison if by chance I hit someone that night. I would have went to prison for manslaughter, and my life would be completely different. And so I think a key element of this is, as you kind of alluded to there, is recognizing that there's there's potential that we as individuals could all end up in that system, and that
Mhm.
doesn't mean necessarily that it's that you completely, that your choice is completely led up to that. Sometimes it's things outside of your control.
Absolutely. There was an incident where, it was a Friday night. Two guys got into a fight outside of a bar, and it happens. There's alcohol involved, there's temper involved, and one gentleman hit the other gentleman. What no one knew is that the one gentleman that was hit had a brain aneurysm that decided to trigger, and he passed
Mhm.
away. So what would have just been two guys having a brawl, right, and going home with a black eye each, ended up with one man in prison on a murder charge, and another man was both men lost families lost both men, right? But it's like you said, some things just aren't up to us, and it's we really there's a certain ripple effect we can't control. So what we try to do, and this is really something when you're talking about an incarcerated setting, is it's the same thing, right? There's a ripple effect sometimes of our actions that are not up to us. It's that the stoic archer, right? We line up our arrow, we do everything best that we can, but once we release the arrow, we really don't influence what happens after that. If there's wind, if someone walks, if there's a bird that comes and knocks the arrow off course. So the thing in prison settings is that those actions where we are not really in control of our emotions can really have huge consequences, that on top of the consequences that already has somebody incarcerated. And this is why
Mhm.
we want to take this work inside, because we want to have these men and women realize you've made a mistake, you're here, but this isn't it. This is not the end and be all of you and your opportunity to live a good life. And there is a way we can provide you with tools that you can start to navigate your emotions. And this is where you have to do the deep work, right? Because that's why stoicism work. It only works if you do the deep work on yourself and know yourself, because then you can identify things that make you tick, what some people call triggers, right? Those pre emotions. We really have to be in tune with ourselves so that we can identify these things and course correct and shift the narrative that we even tell ourselves, right? So, this is where we want to help them backtrack, because a lot of these men and women are going to come home. They're going to come home. They're going to come back into our communities. And if we can help them change those narratives and heal using stoic principles while they're in prison, when they come home, they can help their families heal, and then they can help their communities heal. And this is where we have that ripple effect. But you're absolutely right. Some things are not up to us, but we want to help identify the things that are up to us and how being tuned into that can really improve your life, no matter where you
Right.
are.
Right, right. And it just as you were talking there, it reminded me of that idea from Epictetus as well, that if you're negligent, if you're not maximizing your agency, you just as well burn the capital down. Of course, burning the capital down was like the most heinous crime. Um, and I guess the lesson in that is if you're not maximizing your agency, if you're not taking full ownership of everything within your control, then as we mentioned, y- the worst thing could happen or the best thing could happen, and you have to consider either of those as basically being an indifferent to you. So the challenging part about that is, and this is I think where the compassion element comes in with understanding people, is that no one is ever going to completely maximize their agency on anything. This is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. It's
Mm,
like you talk about in Stoicism, the whole thing of taking full ownership over what's in your control. It's like, what's the upper limits of that? Because I don't think it's perfection. So we're always going to fall somewhat short of the mark. And at the end of the day, a lot of times the results, as we mentioned with something like that, yeah, that guy that struck the guy in the face and ended up killing him for things that was, let's say, directly outside of his control. He also wasn't maximizing his agency, and that obviously had an effect as well. But then the thing is, well, who is maximizing their agency? Who is being that perfect, that sage out there? And I think that's something to really understand, that somewhat of a Christian idea, that we're all inherently flawed, that we all miss the mark. To get back to your stoic archer example, we all miss the mark all the time. Sometimes it's our aim, sometimes it's the wind. But I think that gives us that compassion to look at someone that has been in these prison systems with a bit more compassion.
and I agree with what you're saying, but in order for us to maximize our agency, we have to recognize that we have agency.
Correct.
And
Yes.
a lot of
Yeah.
people don't recognize that they have agency. There's, especially in these settings, there's a feeling of hopelessness, of helplessness, of despair. And you see that outside of prison walls as well. I have no choice, right? That statements like that. Um, so what we also aim to do is to help men and women recognize that they actually have agency. Yes, you are in a prison, but you have agency, which kind of are two, it's really hard to wrap your mind around. How do I have agency in a prison? I'm locked up. They You have a number, right? You're either called a number or you're called your last name, which is why it's important for us to address everyone by their first name. Um, to again restore that humanity. And words are important, right? When people say prisoners or inmates, that's important. It's for us, we don't use that type of language. And so it's about recognizing your agency so that you can maximize it. But you have to recognize it first. And
Hmm.
then it's also maximizing it in a positive way, in the way that it serves your community, your family, right? Because we can maximize our agency, but in a Ted Bundy kind of way, right? And
Hmm.
so we have to. I think we have to really qualify that statement. What does that really mean in today's world that we maximize our agency, and is it always appropriate to do so? So
Hmm.
that's something that I guess it's because of looking at that prism when from an incarcerated setting. What does that mean? Is it like you said? Are we working towards sagehood? That we always maximize our agency in every circumstance that we find ourselves in? Or is it also weighing, is it appropriate to maximize my agency in this circumstance? Is it what's good for the hive? So I don't.
Well, yeah, and I think it's a matter of direction too.
Mm,
I think so. And maybe we can touch on that after digging a bit deeper into this because I thought that was interesting. This sort of loss of faith that people have is what I would call it. This where they have no hope. They don't
mhm,
even recognize that they can act on things that can make their life better. And you're absolutely right. I think that a lot of people lack that insight. And it's one of those things too that you can tell someone that. Like you can tell kids, for example, it's like, yeah, just put in the work and things will be okay. You'll get some results in school or even in the gym or something. But it's almost one of those things that you can't really explain to someone. It's almost something that has to to be felt and discovered by themselves. And I think it's our job as members of the cosmopolitan to help guide people towards that. But it seems to be the case to me that some lessons you can't really explain. Like, it's almost like they have
mm,
to be felt. And so one of the ways you do that is you walk people through action. Like, you physically have
mm,
to walk them through action. So, for example, with someone who doesn't has no self-esteem, a child or something like that, one of the best things you can do for them is put them on in sports or put them in on a training regime, and they
mhm,
probably don't even believe that they can get better. But you say, "No, no, listen, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this," and you literally hold their hand through the whole thing to the point where they actually see, "Actually, yes, I can get better. I can be better. I actually do have some agency." But it is hard to you're absolutely right. What do you think, like, just to expand on that point a little bit more, what do you how do we, make people aware of that fact? Like, how specifically in the prison system as they're coming out?
well, so as they come out, like in our Life Unlocked program, I always ask, when I pick them up and we go to have that meal, and it sounds like a silly question maybe to you and I, but I always ask them what they would like to eat. Where do you want to go for lunch? And there's silence. Sometimes there's dead silence in the car, and sometimes it's on the tip of their tongue because it's what they've been thinking about for 20 years. What am I the first meal I'm going to have when I come out? And just reminding, so this is kind of where it starts for us, right? Where do you want to eat? What do you want to do? And this is the whole exercise also behind taking them clothes shopping. And once they get into our car, we also give them a backpack, and it has snacks and PPE, and has a copy of Kai Whiting's and Leonidas Konstantakos' book, Being Better, Stoicism for a World Worth Living In. It has one of our dichotomy of control posters with stick figures that we give them. So they already get in the car, and here's something for you. Here's your backpack, right? Because they come out with their belongings in a clear trash bag. So the minute that we're in their company, we start to flip that narrative. What do you want to eat? And then we take them shopping. Pick out what you want. And you see that change happen, that all of a sudden after 20 years or 10 years or 5 years, they can choose the color of something that they want to wear. They forget these things. They forget their favorite colors. Some men and women forget their clothes size because no one asked them in the last 20 years or 10 years, what would you like to wear? So it's about asking them questions and showing them from the minute that they're out of that institution that they have a choice, that they can make a choice. And it's the same thing when we run in prison programming. It's where do you want to sit, right? It's not assigning seats. It's where do you want to sit, addressing everyone by their first name. Um, And philosophy is not an easy thing to teach, right? Not even in a classroom, right? Philosophy 101. And then to do that in a prison, where some men and women think I can never understand this because I didn't finish high school. How am I going to read this stuff? And like you said, is holding that hand, right? And walking them through it. And the way we compose our materials, it's at a level that's accessible to everyone. And it's also that we want to hopefully have stoic mentors where men and women can mentor each other and bounce things off of each other in the time that we're not in the institution in between weeks. So it's really showing them you can understand this, you can do this, and it doesn't matter what your reading level is. We're going to walk you through this. And no matter how long it takes, we're going to be right here. So that's a way, I guess, of like you said, sometimes walking that child through that sporting event and guiding them. And that builds self confidence, right? And then you tap into their self worth because these things go hand in hand. And this is where that transformation takes place. And it's a beautiful transformation to watch, especially when they realize themselves that they can do it and they realize that they can understand these things and then talk about them. So I think it's like
Right,
it's what you
right.
said. It's about compassion. It's about compassion. It's about patience. It's about the same way that I was walked through some really tricky topics in Stoicism. I have a great mentor that really worked with me and walked me through these things, and we want to give that back and pay that forward.
It's such a crucial thing. I think the one of the themes I took out of that what you said is that you have to meet people where they are.
Yeah.
Uh, it really reminded me of one of my favorite quotes that I don't think about very often anymore, but it really came to mind. It's actually about strength, but I often think of strength and virtue as really the same thing in many ways. But it's, anyways, the quote is strength starts where you are, not where you used to be or where you want to be. And to get really practical with it, if you want to get better at something, at anything, if you want to get better, period, you have to find out where you are and accept where you are and then make a plan based on where you are. And I think that's one of the hardest things to accept, especially when you talk about things like ego and that when that gets involved, because a lot of times I think there's a even a bit of shame about where we are. You know, talk about someone who's maybe been in prison for a while. There might be a lot of shame accompanied with that. And to admit, for example, that maybe your literary skills aren't so great. Maybe you
Mhm.
actually need to work on that before you can read, Kai Whiting's and Leonidas's books or book. Like that's a humbling thing. But if you don't accept where you are, you can't get better. If you're blind, if you're just don't
Mhm.
admit the fact that you have trouble reading, well, the first thing that you're going to help someone with is probably not reading because you're going to assume that they can read fine. So you're going to give them this book, and then they're too embarrassed to say that they struggle with reading. That's not going to be good for them in the long term. But it is this sort of this humbling aspect of really accepting where you are, knowing where you are first, and then having the humility to accept where you are, so that you can make an appropriate plan to move yourself forward.
Mhm. And we definitely recognize that, which is why the we wrote an accompanying handbook, which is a bespoke handbook, which really breaks down these topics so that it becomes accessible, right? We really stay away. There are no Greek words, right? The Greek words aren't there. There's no Latin words, and I mean, I get tongue twisted sometimes, with those terms, and I don't
Mhm.
want to put that
Yeah.
on anyone else. Again, it's about remembering how we all started and really keeping that humility as we go through this. And you're right, we have to meet everybody where they're at, whether they're incarcerated or not, right? Because that's where I want to be met. I don't want to be judged on. past actions, and I can't be judged on future actions because the future hasn't happened yet. And we talk about hope and fear being the side of the same coin. If you cease to hope, you cease to fear. And that's one of the things where we want to take it day by day, which is why the this immediatist view of stoicism is so important, right? Am I doing the right thing now? Staying centered in the now. And I am here right now, whether they're incarcerated, we meet them there, we greet them, and let's start here. I never ask about what someone's done that landed them in prison. Eventually, the men and women share as it comes out in dialogue, and they've done a lot of work on themselves. And there's a lot of insight that happens, right? Because they've done some work on themselves. But it's like you brought up ego. When ego gets involved, things get really blurred, right? Because we're not working with a true narrative. And we can't recognize where we are if ego is involved because ego will tell us something completely different. And so one thing that I found in these settings is that rarely have I encountered ego that has skewed vision, that they aren't aware of where they are and why they're there. So it humbles me to walk into those settings and see optimism and see love and see compassion for each other and for their families, because you wouldn't think that you would find that behind those walls. And it's amazing to be there. I'm humbled to be there, and it's wanting to just give them all of their agency, or recognize that they have it, that they have the agency, that we're meeting them where they're at, and that they're worthy. I hear that a lot, where they thank us for thinking of them. They thank us for coming in and spending time with them. And for me, it's also, I thank them for allowing us to be there. We wouldn't be there if they wouldn't come into the room and share their space with us. So it's really different. And I invite people to come in with us as volunteers to change some attitudes, some perspectives, and some narratives that are out there.
What role or what's the importance of coming to terms with and processing the past? Because I know you mentioned that you don't
Mhm.
ask what people have done, but I think I see this practically a lot where sometimes people focus on where they want to go, but they haven't quite dealt with the trauma, which could be something that
Mhm.
someone did to them. It could be something they did that that they're not proud of. But it almost seems like if you haven't really dealt with the past properly and processed that and come to terms with that, it's almost like you can't accept where you are truly, and you also can't move forward, I think, because you're being weighed down. And so I'm curious
Mhm.
how you think about that. The idea being once they get out, they've processed that properly. But is that always the case? And do you think that processing that past, whatever they've done or whatever they've been through, do you think that's a prerequisite to, I suppose, enlightenment in a single word?
I think so. And the reason I say this, I had a conversation with a community resource manager at a women's facility last week, and we spoke about trauma. And prison is full of men and women that have been traumatized in one way or another. And that trauma, not dealing with that trauma, has then led to the negative emotions that most likely led to their crime, right? That unprocessed trauma. So what happens is when you get into that prison setting, there are opportunities for the incarcerated men and women to process that trauma. And that's that first step of healing. Because and you're absolutely right. If you don't process the past, if you don't process the trauma, the things that you have done or that have been done to you, you cannot get to that inner space where you drop that shame. You spoke about shame earlier. When we
Mhm.
drop the shame, we drop the I should have, and we accept ourselves and we accept where we are. And that then becomes the jumping off point, right? To our start to living that flourishing life, to seeing that we have worth and that we have value. So I don't think it's possible to move on and to live that flourishing life if these past things have been left unresolved, because where you are is always going to be skewed. You're never going to have a clear picture, and it's very difficult to really be in tune with yourself if those things haven't been resolved. And that's where the inner work becomes so important. And this is where stoicism can be so vital, because you have to do the inner work in order to find out where I am today. I've got to work through a lot of stuff to make sure that I have a clear picture of where I am. Now, you do have, we're human, you do have some people that are very uncomfortable doing that work because it's not easy, because we're pushing ourselves. We really, and this is where strength comes in. You spoke about strength, and courage comes in, and strength and courage show up when we want or are asked to do things that make us feel really uncomfortable and that may even be painful. But this is where we kind of develop those tools, right? Where we can develop our strength, when we develop our courage. And then when we go through these negative experiences, we come out on the other side, and then we realize, wow, I came out of this even better than when I went into it. So I think it's so important that we address these things. And if it's talked about, we hold space. I know a young man that killed his two step siblings, and his dad and his stepmother. And he was 16 when he did this. And we speak on a regular basis, in a sense of, he knows what he's done, and it's very high profile, so it's one of those things you can't run away from. But the insight and the work and the remorse, it's there. So now we have a place that we can jump off of. No matter how horrific the crime is, he was 16 years old, he was a juvenile, and there was a lot of unresolved trauma. And now he's in a completely different state. It's been 20 years. He's an adult. He's processed his trauma, and the growth that has come out of that has led to remorse and insight, right, into the victim, into his crimes. So, and some men and women choose not to. But I think we have to, especially as Stoics, we have to embrace those that are willing to do that inner work on themselves, and again wrap our arms around them and pull them closer instead of pushing them away in a non-judgmental
Mm.
way.
Right. Right. Yeah, and it's so tempting uh, to try and change the story in some ways to justify our actions.
Mm,
This is something I got insight from myself actually. Um, I guess about 3 years ago, I actually physically wrote down all the things in the past that was bothering me, and in excruciating detail. I was actually on Jordan Peterson's advice. He said that if you're thinking about the past and you're bothered by it, there's a lesson there that you haven't extracted. And so you need to extract that lesson and then you can move on. And I took that to heart, and it took me like 6 months, but I wrote down not just bad moments, but good moments too. But the bad ones are the,
mm,
the harder ones. But I realized as I was writing that is that it was so tempting. You're writing something down, and when you write something down or type it, it becomes real. It's there, right? Especially writing, because writing, it's ink and paper. It's it's just so visceral and so real, and it's so tempting to want to change the story a little bit, or to maybe I don't know, provide some justification for why you acted that way or this and that. And it's not like that's not important, because sometimes the context is important. But I think a lot of times that's a hard thing to accept. It's like an ego death. And I actually catch myself doing this sometimes in the present. Sometimes I'll do something stupid at work or something, for example, and I'll immediately start thinking of, you know, what to tell people when they ask me that I'd make it look like it's not my fault. And I catch myself doing that. I'm like, no, no, I made a mistake. I did something wrong here. I have to own that. But it's really hard to do. And so I can imagine when you're dealing with someone that's done something, particularly like that example you mentioned where they murdered their step siblings, like that takes a lot of, I guess, just ego death. Like, you have to be raw about it, and you have to really come to terms with that in its fullness, in the full truth of whatever it is that you did or whatever it is that you experienced. And that's hard. That's extremely hard. And I don't know, what do you think allows people to do that? Do you think it's like you mentioned, um having that space for them to do that, letting them know that it's even a possibility, giving them at least a little bit of faith that they can get better?
Absolutely. And it is providing that space and that non-judgmental space, right? So when they do share something like that, okay, that happened. But you're not that same person. You are not that same person. And what the state of California has done in its sentencing, it's looked at juveniles differently. So basically, they looked at scientific evidence that your brain isn't fully developed until about age 25, right? When it comes to tying together actions and consequences. It's a fact. It's not an excuse, it's just a fact. But it's also, you were 16 years old. There was a lot of trauma, a lot of abuse. Let's look at all of the facts, not excuses, but facts. And then let's go from there. Let's work through that. And no matter how painful it is, sometimes we really have to go as deep as we can and work through that pain to get back on that track to healing.
Mm,
It doesn't work any other way. I mean, even with ourselves that are not in prison, that have hurt someone or we've been hurt, the best way for us to get through that is to really process it and think about, why am I hurt? Why did I hurt that person? And keep asking why until we get to the source. And that's where we start healing. That's where we do the work. It is painful and it's uncomfortable, but this is how we grow. Again, this is how where we find our strength and we find our courage, and we can really live up to those stoic virtues. It's not a cakewalk. It really isn't.
mhm,
But if we choose to walk this path, it's, I think, one of the most rewarding journeys that I've ever been on. So, and this is something that we want to share, and it's about holding that non-judgmental space and letting them know that no matter what they say, no matter what they've done, we're going to embrace them.
mhm. I tend to think too that, I think the cosmos has designed our mothers to be that for us naturally, because I feel like mothers are so, generally speaking, and this isn't always the case, but just this full acceptance of who and what their children are. And I've thought a lot about how a lot of times good mothers and some good fathers as well will see this. They look at their child who's cranky, crabby, doing terrible things, sometimes evil things, like children. Sometimes children are really cruel, right? If you think about it and watch what they do and say sometimes. And it's fascinating to me thinking about it now that there's correction there. It's like, no, we don't say that, we don't do this, but there's also this full acceptance of it. And it's almost like when a parent is looking at their child, they're looking at not what they are in this moment, but they're looking at the person that they could be. It's almost like they're looking at their full potential. It's like, you know, yeah, this kid just said something very rude, but he's just a kid. And then I can't see why we can't apply that same mentality if someone's 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. It's like, yeah, they did that terrible thing, but they're just human. They're just human. And I think that's hard to tap into, but again, to get back to what we were talking about earlier, I think that comes from acceptance of your own inadequacies. It comes from reflection of self first, and then you expand that outwards to others. I think you can't really have compassion for others until you really understand that you're not so perfect either, right?
Absolutely. And it's, um, you have some people that judge themselves very harshly, whether it's appropriate or not appropriate, and then they project that on other people, right? And this is when this whole judgment comes in. And this is another thing about the beauty of Stoicism is we have to challenge our beliefs. There are beliefs we grew up with, and we grew up with them, so we believe them. We don't even challenge them, but they're so ingrained within us that we never stop at 1 minute and say, wait a minute, do I really believe this? Is this really true? Or is this something that's been passed down to the generations through my family, right? The way some families always vote a certain way, or some families always have these traditions, is that we don't check ourselves enough and say, is this belief that I have valid? Does it make sense? Is it appropriate? And if it isn't, why am I still carrying this belief around with me, especially if it causes me to judge other people in such a negative way?
Mm,
And people that are just living and going through their life, everybody's always going through something, right? But and I think we find that more and more now, as we've really gotten divisive. And I see it in
mhm,
America, and it's these beliefs are bantied about, but it doesn't seem to be that they are challenged for their validity. And something just because it was true and a valid belief for me 10 years ago means that it still is today. And I think that's where um, we can all do some work is challenging our beliefs. Are they valid? Are they appropriate? And are they damaging? Are they damaging to us? Are they damaging to our communities? And I think this is where you kind of have people walking around with preconceived notions. Why should I care about someone that's incarcerated? Could be
mm,
your child next week. Could be you tomorrow.
mhm,
And the other thing is these incarcerated men and women, a large percentage come home. They could be our neighbor. You could have a neighbor and not even know that this person was incarcerated. They come home, and we really want to help them heal where they are, whether they're incarcerated or whether we work with them in the communities. Change those perceptions and just kind of go up against these false narratives.
mhm. Do you think freedom is scary? I've heard this before that freedom from prison when they do get out,
Mm,
there's a fear there. You mentioned where they have trouble with choices.
mm.
Not that they have trouble necessarily with choices, but that they have not had a choice for so long that they've forgotten that there's a future that you actually do have a choice, and maybe that future is happening right now if you're getting out. Do you think there is that fear of freedom? Is that something that you've noticed?
They actually have a term for it. It's actually called gate fever. So, gate fever really is that gate opens and you're standing there with your belongings, and then what? So you're because once you're in a prison, everything is very regulated, right? Whom you spend your time with, when you go to work, if you have a job, when you wake up in the morning, when there's lights out at night, your whole day is regulated, right? When you can go into the day room and all of these things onto the exercise yard are very regulated. And you have that structure and routine. And routine is safety, right? I We all find safety in our routine, right? It helps us get through our day. So when that gate opens, it's very scary because there is no routine. You have to make that for yourself. And then even I'm a stranger. When even when their family picks them up, it's a very overwhelming experience. Everything's coming at you very, very fast, especially with your family. If they haven't seen you in a long time, everybody is very excited. You're around 20 people. The entire environment is uncontrolled, right? And in prison, men and women tend to control their behavior because there are sanctions against even the slightest infraction. Out here, there are no sanctions against the slightest infraction. And so it makes things very, very uncertain. And when we look at why men and women go back to prison, why there is such a high recidivism rate for men and women that have been incarcerated for less than 10 years, it's fear. It's a lack of emotional support, financial support, community support. And that fear will drive them to fall back into old patterns. They may end up breaking a law on purpose so they can go back into an environment where they found stability. So it's very, very valid what you pointed out, and which is why the reentry work is so crucial because it sets them up either for success or for failure.
Right.
And it can also then that fear can lead to not only recidivism but also to drug abuse because this is what they've used before to deal with stressors, and certain behavioral patterns that they may have put down may arise again because it's just this uncertainty of how do I deal with life coming at me so fast and I haven't been prepared. And this is why we want to prepare them. So stoicism and using those stoic principles to help them deal with those overwhelming emotions and checking those emotions and those perceptions so that they respond in a way that's positive for them and their families versus falling into old behavioral patterns. So it's very valid. It's very valid.
Yeah, and I'm playing around with applying that to philosophy in general because you could certainly make the case that philosophy allows you to become free.
Mm,
You could argue in many ways that that's really what it's about. Um, and then you look at people sometimes where they're in situations that aren't good, they're rough. Maybe it's a toxic relationship or something like that, and they could leave, but they don't. And I'm just wondering if that same fear that inmates would have, where all of a sudden now I have choices and I have decisions and things aren't decided for me, that fear of freedom, if we can get conditioned to that in our own lives as well, and in toxic relationships or in toxic jobs or work environments or even just bad thought patterns.
mm,
There's a line from the Eagles I love. So oftentimes it happens that we live our lives in chains and we never even know we have the key.
mm,
And I think there's two parts of that. There's sometimes we don't know we have the key. Sometimes we do know we have the key, but we're refusing to use it out of that very same thing that you mentioned, that fear, that fear of freedom. And have you given any thought into where that comes from? Like, why do we seem to be do you think it's just, like, these toxic thought patterns that we get into that end up very circular in nature? Do you think there's a fear of maybe we're gonna fall back into the same pattern? Like, "Hey, if they let me out, I'm just gonna do something else bad." Where do you think that comes from? It almost seems counterintuitive, right?
It does, and so there's several things to unpack here. So freedom is so we're speaking of physical freedom, right? So we have physical freedom and then we have mental freedom, right? Because I can, like you said, philosophy can I feel freer since starting my practice of stoicism in a way where I don't see any limits because the only limits I can see are the ones I'm going to impose on myself. And why would I do that? That's just not appropriate
Right.
for myself. Um, so I can be free in a prison cell because I'm a
Yeah.
student of philosophy, right? Or I can be sit on my couch and be in prison because I've imprisoned
Right.
myself, right? So this idea of being imprisoned, I don't think it has to do with where we physically are, but where we mentally are. And I think if you mentioned that toxic relationship, if that's all someone knows, if they've seen it at home, whether it's been codependent relationships, whether it's been seeing abuse at home, that's normal. That's normal. And those things are
Mhm.
generational, right? Unfortunately. Oh, my grandmother stayed and her husband beat her. My mom stayed and my dad beat her. So this is normal, right? So this is where we have to change that narrative and again show that you actually have agency. It's that forgetting that we have agency because it was never pointed out to us that we have agency. I don't know if I have the key if someone doesn't help me find the key, which is why people in those situations actually get extracted. And I use that word very clearly. They get extracted because it takes an outside force or an outside person to point out their condition and then provide that key. So the thing with the incarcerated men and women, and I've seen that, is that some, when they find out, they go to the parole board and the parole board sets a date for them to come home, they will sabotage themselves out of the fear that you're
Mm.
speaking of because they are going to go into an environment that they can't control. Stoicism teaches us you can't control the future. Well, the future is actually not even here. So why are we spending so much time thinking about the future instead of doing the work and doing everything right now in the moment so that we set ourselves up for whatever is to come, good or bad? We're going to be ready to face it. And that's where the focus should be, right? Because I'm fearing things that haven't happened and I'm making myself miserable instead of
Mhm.
working on lining up that arrow so that once I take my shot, I've done everything and I'm prepared for it to go off course, but I'm also prepared for it to hit the target. So
Right.
I've seen people sabotage themselves. I've also seen it in situations where someone has gotten a date and they don't want to tell anybody because there are some situations if someone's in there for a life sentence, they may want to sabotage someone else getting out. So a lot of men and women don't want to tell anybody because they don't want anyone to ruin their chances. So it's kind of it works both ways, right? I really want to go home. I want my chance. I already have a place in the transitional housing. I have made plans. I've lined up my shot on one hand, and then you have on the other hand, I don't want to lose my security, so I think I'm just going to stay another year, add another year to my sentence, and see if I'm prepared then to come out.
Mhm.
But I think it's human nature, right? And this is why I think philosophy, like I said, is such a powerful tool to set us free and to provide us with that mental freedom, which can then lead to physical freedom. But we all need to be led to it.
Yeah.
I don't think
That
that the
sorry, but no, that's becoming really clear to me, and I think that's where maybe the last point that we can end on here, because I think it's a beautiful point, is just how much we actually do need others and to help others. I think that's very crucial, and it gets the point gets conflated a lot in Stoicism because other people are externals and they're indifferent. But that term indifferent, again, people conflate that to mean something that it's really not. I think we do need community and people that recognize the potential in us to become better and to help guide each other towards redemption. To use um, Joaquin Phoenix's speech. Have you seen Joaquin Phoenix's Oscar acceptance speech by chance?
no, I haven't.
I'd
But
love
I'm
to
a
just
big
look it
fan of
up
his
because
work, yeah.
I love him. But he accepted this award, and he put this really well. So if you just bear with me, I'd like to see if I can get the. I mean, he's just an amazing actor for one, but also a very deep and often dark person as well. Um, I mean, he played the Joker, and it's
Brilliantly.
brilliantly. Um,
But it goes
so
into
let me just.
tapping into this is an example of a guy that really knows himself well, right? And can
Yes.
tap into that darkness, and he really made that come alive, and it almost looked like he had fun doing it, right? And because
Yeah.
there we all have that within us, and if we can tap into it in a non-threatening or harming way, again, you have to know yourself that that's inside of you. But there's also
Right.
that goodness
Right.
inside of us. There's that love inside of us, that compassion inside of us. And that's something we can also tap into. But we tend to tap in more into the negative because we believe these false narratives. And we need to
Yeah.
change the narrative and change how we see ourselves. And then we change in how we see others.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't know any better. Let me just read you this little paragraph
Yeah,
here. I won't read it all, but I have been a scoundrel all my life. I've been selfish. I've been cruel at times, hard to work with, and I'm grateful that so many of you in this room have given me a second chance. I think that's when we're at our best, when we support each other, not when we cancel each other out for our past mistakes, but when we help each other to grow, when we educate each other, when we guide each other to redemption. When he was 17, my brother, River Phoenix, wrote this lyric. He said, "Run to the rescue with love, and peace will follow."
that's it.
So I think, yeah, just I think that's the role we play is in the cosmos. I think that's a role that we all play. We help guide each other towards redemption, despite our insufficiencies, despite our capacity for evil, despite our manifestations of evil in the world. That's what we're here for, to help guide each other towards redemption.
And in recognition of our own failures, right? And in recognition
Absolutely.
of
Yeah.
the good in the other. It's what we always say, to see the prisoner in us and see us in the prisoner. It's it works the same way. We see each other in each other.
Yeah.
And Marcus Aurelius, we're born for the other.
Yeah. Beautiful. I think that's a wonderful spot to end. Thank you so much for coming on here and talking about this. I know it's a hard topic. It's not an easy one to talk about, and it gets into a lot of dark themes. And so I appreciate you taking the time to come and chat with me on it. And I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. And where can people find you if they want to help support your work?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us and for engaging in this beautiful conversation. And as that can go in so many different directions, right? So yes, people can learn more about us at wisdomunlocked.org. They can also reach out to us via our contact page if they have any questions, if they'd like to have some conversation, if they want to enter into a dialogue with us, they can come to our website, read our articles, and we're happy to have these conversations and to start beginning to change the mind shift and narrative around this topic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again, Santara. All the best.
Thank you so much. Happy New Year.